And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our, I want to call them keynote speakers. We're not going to do a keynote. We're going to actually have a conversation with FCC Commissioner Rob McDowell. Rob's a good friend of the Phoenix Center, very talented lawyer, and we're anxious to hear his thoughts on just sort of what's going on, and we really appreciate him being here. So without further ado, Commissioner, come on down. Whenever you feel comfortable, you have a better sign. I promise I won't ask you like to have the Larry Summers define the internet ecosystem. So you've been busy?
A little busy at the FCC.
All right. Well, let's start. And we've been asking these questions throughout the morning, but we really welcome your perspective on this. Why do you think the FCC lost in Comcast? We know you wrote the original decision, but did it match up to your original arguments?
Wait, I didn't write the decision.
No, I mean, it matches your sentence.
Right. That's straight.
Oh, I'm sorry, absolutely.
Right, so I dissented in that case. The FCC was just clearly wrong on the law. There were 20 different reasons as why a court could have vacated the order, and it went right to the heart of jurisdiction. So I think it's been spun as this broad decision that incapacitates the FCC to act in any regard in the realm of information services or any other spot. But in reality, it was a fairly narrow decision based on the case before it. And the court basically said that the FCC did not tether its arguments well to any specific congressional mandate, and therefore overstepped its jurisdiction, and it should be struck down in that regard.
So,
on that basis.
Or at least our reading of the decision is that I think Title I still exists. I mean, it's been upheld by the court. Chris had a sort of unique perspective on it, but in our minds, the court gave the commission very clear directions that if they wanted to pursue Title I, they could pursue Title I. Do you think Title I is still a viable option that we can do, barring a congressional clarification right here, right now?
Well, Title I still exists.
Right.
The Congress wrote it. It's still on the books.
Right.
And it has been upheld over the years as a tool for the commission to do a lot of things, provided that whatever that action is really tethered to a specific mandate as envisioned by Congress. What this really is all about, as I've said before, is net neutrality. So Congress has not enacted any statutory provision regarding net neutrality. And I think, as much as the court, I think, tried to be somewhat polite in the Comcast decision to say, hey, FCC, you could always try again if you wanted to, it was also quite clearly indicating that you're probably not going to succeed unless there's a specific congressional mandate to go do something. And with net neutrality, there isn't anything there. Now, I think it's important, let me just digress for a quick minute, to say we all want an open internet that maximizes consumer freedom. And lo and behold, that's what we have today. And that's what we've had since the internet was born. And that came about as a result of the policies that are in place today and have been in place for years. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. So what's actually being proposed is not only something that would discard decades of overwhelmingly really unanimous bipartisan consensus, but would also dramatically affect the legal and regulatory landscape in such ways to cause uncertainty. There wasn't uncertainty in the marketplace until really last September, after the chairman's speech announcing his plans. And then further uncertainty with the idea of classifying internet access information services as Title II common carriage. That's where the uncertainty began. Before that, investment was thriving. Consumers were in a marketplace where they had maximum freedom. Services were being deployed. Innovation was going through the roof. So what has changed in the interim is the government has decided that it wants to intervene, and that is what's causing the uncertainty.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. In our paper, and we've been talking about it today, it's sort of a Morton's fork, where it's on one hand, the argument made by the chairman in his own words is that you could either have you do Title I, which is legally uncertain, or you could do Title II, which in his mind gives you more legal certainty, but it does open the door to heavy-handed regulation. But trust me, or trust any commission, we won't exercise that authority once we have that. I mean, do you think that's credible? It's a realistic expectation? Is it good policy?
And that's called Morton's fork.
Yeah, George, you look it up. It's not a fork for Morton's demonstration.
It reminds me what the knife said to the spoon, which is let's get the fork out of here.
Yeah, exactly.
So in this case, I think it's a false choice. Angela's having a heart attack in the back there. So.
She's seen Jordan's other comment earlier, right?
This is a false choice. We have to do something, and then there's two options, either Title I or the so-called third way, which is not a third way. It is only the second way, which is Title II. And it's been there since 1934. So instead of thinking about what the government can do for more regulation, if there's a concern, as I've been proposing for about 3 years now, let us look at promoting more competition in the last mile. Wireless is the best opportunity, but the quickest opportunity to do that. Wireless broadband is the fastest growing segment of the broadband market. Let's continue to pursue policies that allow for more competition of all platforms, but right now, bringing more spectrum to auction would be terrific. Continuing our work on white spaces actually would resolve a lot of these public policy challenges, whether it's the net neutrality concern or whether it's broadband deployment and adoption. So there are a number of different ways other than regulation that actually provides or helps really spur the creation of abundance and competition in the marketplace rather than reverting to regulation and rationing. And that is unfortunately, I think, where we're headed.
Right, well, I mean, let's actually take some of the arguments in no particular order that's set forth in favor of why we should trust the third way that it works. We can sort of take them in order. I mean, first and foremost is the thing that we've been bringing up a lot, is that there seems to be a very big likelihood that price regulation is back on the table. What do you think?
Sure, so let's look at the so-called Title II light idea. 201 and 202 are part of that. 201 and 202 are broad and sweeping and talk about the regulation of rates, terms and conditions, or charges, actually, as it's called in the statute. So that, you could say, well, there's the absence of tariffing under 203. Okay, terrific. So how are you going to regulate those rates, terms and conditions as 201 and 202 call for? Well, that would be case by case. So in the absence of tariffs, assuming there would be such forbearance, you are looking squarely at economic regulation, because that's what 201 and 202 are all about. So to say there's not going to be price regulation, but to leave any part of 201 or 202 on the table means there will be economic regulation, therefore rate regulation. Can't escape it.
Right, and you just mentioned that wireless certainly will have a very big role with increasing access to wireless, and the chairman has talked about we want to make America number one for wireless, and you've talked about it, Commissioner Baker's talked about it, all the commissioners. Yet, if you look at what the commission has done, this commission, it has said the actions indicate an increase in wireless regulation. For example, stuff I mentioned earlier today, you have the Harbinger order with the de facto price cap. Went out on delegated authority. In fact, it was done in a voluntary merger commitment. Spectrum cap, it was done in a voluntary merger commitment, which was posted on eDocs 3 days after the order was released. So you couldn't even have any opportunity for notice and comment. We have ETFs, the bill shop. How do we have a vibrant wireless market when you're seeing all these storm clouds come over the horizon?
Well, let's take them one at a time. Let's look at each proceeding and the comments in each proceeding, examine the record. Obviously, Commissioner Baker and I both expressed our concern with the wireless competition report for the first time in over 8 years, not concluding that the wireless market is competitive. Yet we see the vast majority of Americans having access to at least 5 carriers. We have more and more Americans having access to wireless broadband providers, and certainly innovation throughout the wireless industry and at the edge, as people like to call it, with applications for mobile apps, is exploding. And the United States is by far the leader in the world with mobile apps and with wireless broadband. So it's a concern if we are going to be looking at more regulation of the wireless sector, which has thrived with a very light touch approach. And I think we need to learn from that history lesson. But I'm going to take it one docket at a time and hope for the best, but it does appear that right now everything is on the table.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, well, let's turn to something that you've had a lot of experience with, even going back to your start at the commission, forbearance proceedings. The commission, I forgot the exact date, but I remember you wrote actually very good concurrence, or was dissent, I forgot, but on the process that the commission uses for forbearance. And the argument now is forbearance is an easy thing. Don't worry, we'll be able to do this. And then you have the Quest order, which came out last week, which my reading of it, because it did a very antitrust, like what are the hurricane laws, defining the really narrow markets, that it looks that forbearance is going to be real hard. And then you also have the issue that even if it is easy, let's say you guys come up with a list of 1,000 things, because we're all human and fallible, the next day the order comes out, somebody in some business case is going to go, you forgot 1,001. Is this an easy process? Is it something that the commission, it's been a difficult process getting like harness data done in a year that the statute says you have to do?
Well, Section 10 is very clear in terms of how the commission is supposed to approach these things. The intent behind it, I think, is clear. And the concern might be as we go forward, as I wrote in that statement, are we raising the bar beyond what Congress intended? And so if the commission is raising the bar to such a degree to where it's virtually impossible to achieve forbearance, to get forbearance granted, then that might be trying to circumvent a clear congressional mandate. So that might be an issue for the appellate courts going forward, and we'll have to see where the commission wants to go from here.
And that brings sort of the second question. The argument is, well, the commission's never backed down from a forbearance decision, although this whole reclassification seems to be sort of a complete reversal. We had a lot of discussion on the previous panel on, no agency can be expected to remain static and change. I mean, do you think forbearance can remain intact, or do you think, going the themes we talked about earlier, there is a potential that this commission or commission down the road can go, I don't like this, we're back to more regulation? Because that's sort of one of the dangers that we're doing by sort of playing with forbearance, if you will.
Well, some commissioners have expressed their concern that forbearance is just not a good idea, period. I always like to look at the statute, and Congress thought it was a good idea and gave us a clear directive there. So I think the nature of forbearance is changing from the commission's perspective, and I don't know if the commission would grant forbearance maybe outside of the proposed Title II forbearance, which we can talk more about in a minute, but if the commission will do that going forward, I don't know. But certainly it seems like the bar has been raised, and it will become more difficult for those who are interested in forbearance. It's going to be more difficult.
And what about unbundling? The chairman's office and everybody said, oh no, unbundling is not back on the table. Unbundling was left out of the National Broadband Plan. Yet, if you keep digging around, we keep seeing that perhaps unbundling is back on the table. Is it?
I don't know. Again, this is sort of like the other question. We'll take each docket as it comes. And if the discussion is special access, for instance, I think I've been calling out for about 3 years for real granular data gathering, a really cell site by cell site, building by building snapshot of the special access market, just as was done in the Bell IXC mergers of 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not as difficult to do as you might think. And if we had done this 3 years ago, when I was first talking about it, then we'd be done by now. And we could then render a decision that will be upheld on appeal. But in terms of unbundling as a policy coming back, I don't know what to tell you. Again, we'll take each draft order as they come up from the Bureau and see how it goes.
So you spend a lot of time talking to various stakeholders. You spend a lot of time talking to Wall Street investors, that kind of stuff. How important is it particularly given the economy where it is today, and just knowing how incredibly expensive it is to be in this business, is it to have a clear signal from the FCC that investment in entry is welcome? It just seems that, we set this national broadband plan, we want to, get deployment out to every place in America, yet the FCC is sending very clear signals that they want to reduce profitability and make entry harder. How do we reconcile those two things?
I try to go out of my way to talk to investors of all sizes, not just large institutional investors who are trading stock, but venture capitalists, private equity, everything from the early stage investor in all sorts of different companies to late stage investors as well, passive secondary market as well as more active. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. By the way, domestically and internationally as well. There's a great deal of concern and anxiety in the investment community about what is going on at the FCC. And I think that's because some big, dramatic ideas have been proposed that would change the regulatory landscape and discard a couple decades worth of the consensus. So it's a concern. I hope my fellow commissioners will continue to listen. In that the broadband plan calls for tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. The chairman last October 1st actually, when we had a workshop on capital investment and broadband, he said that this money would have to come from the private sector. So obviously it will. And if it is supposed to come from the private sector, we need to be listening to those investors. And again, these are not just investors in incumbents. These are startups. These aren't just investors in network operators. They're application providers as well. All stripes and flavors of investors. And it's very, very concerning that given turmoil in general in the capital markets, that we could be adding to that anxiety and inhibiting investment with a lot of these discussions. That would be a shame if it had an adverse effect on broadband deployment and adoption in this country.
Well, let me just go back to a point you made earlier that, one of the rationales that's been made about we need the third way is the implementation of the broadband plan. But let's put that to the side for a moment and focus on net neutrality. One of the issues that we've certainly run out is that when you talk about net neutrality, everybody you talk to, you get a different answer. Sometimes if you talk to certain people, you get multiple answers depending on what the other argument is. And I think that has created a lot of undue chaos in the debate. Our view, and this is what we wrote in the paper, if you focus on the two things, there's actually sort of, if you will, the EU approach of transparency and blocking. I think it is very possible to, as opposed to, the other arguments here are things like media concentration. This isn't a media concentration, where net neutrality somehow morphs into an unbundling argument. But again, the core issues are transparency and anti-competitive blocking. You look at what the commission did in the Truth in Billing hearing, which was about 4 months prior to the Comcast case, and the commission laid out a very cohesive Title I argument, citing the cases where it had been upheld. So it seems that can be done under Title I if the commission wanted to do it. And then it seems that in a sort of a blocking case, and you've talked about this before, I'd like to sort of bring it out again, if you were to say, this is what we wrote, 251, and we took this argument from Kevin Werbach, which I think he was right on this, in that if you go from the sacrosanct view that the traffic goes through, right, that's sort of the number one thing in telecom policy, there's interconnection rights, the traffic goes through, that if you were to tie to some sort of interconnection and harm, rather than try to regulate the internal machinations of the network management, I think you might have a Title I regime which could be upheld until Congress decides to update and clarify it if they so choose. What do you think about that?
Let me answer that more broadly, which is I think there are plenty of legal tools at various agencies' disposal to address the still hypothetical concern that a broadband provider is going to act in an anti-competitive way if it's deceptive trade practices. The earlier panel was talking about the FTC. I think there are a lot of good rules on the books, time-tested deceptive trade practices. We can work on that. if there's a restraint of trade issue, if there's a concentration of market power and abuse of that market power, and all the bad things that flow from that, there are laws in the books that will address that right now. So the notion that consumers are somehow not protected, that there's absolutely nothing that can be done if a broadband provider wants to act in an anti-competitive way, by the way, against their own economic interest. You know, part of your business plan is to frustrate your customers' desires. That's a really knucklehead approach, and I think there's going to be a substantial amount of competition in the marketplace. There'll be some broadband provider that's going to want to win over your customer. The short-term incremental gain, hypothetically, that an internet access provider is going to be able to harvest from frustrating their own customers' desires is going to be far outweighed by the long-term gain of their competitors to be able to win that customer over for the long term. So that is, at the start of this whole debate, something that gets left out of the discussion. If you want to be that knuckleheaded, go ahead. Someone else is going to take away your customers, and you're going to go out of business ultimately. And as we have, especially more and more competition in wireless broadband, that's where consumers are saying they want to go for a lot of this. That's going to be a wonderful environment that's beautifully chaotic and terrific for consumers. But there are plenty of laws on the books that protect consumers. So the notion that they're somehow unprotected in the status quo that's existed since the birth of the internet is really a fallacy.
So what do you say?
Larry, you have about 5 minutes. You want to take some
Okay, I'm
questions
sorry.
from the
I didn't
audience?
have one. Go ahead, please. Questions from the
Questions
audience.
from the audience for the commissioner? Not, we'll turn. Question? Anyone? Really?
I put them to sleep.
Yeah, here's one.
Lynn's got one.
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. When you suggest that it's a knuckleheaded idea to frustrate your customers, what about the issue that customers don't always know where their frustration is coming from? They don't know whether their problem is their ISP or the application provider, or it's out there somewhere in the core of the network, or it's the computer.
Right, so are you asking then, should there be disclosure requirements put on peer-to-peer providers? For instance, consumers don't know when they're downloading peer-to-peer applications that their computer's going to work 24/7 for that application provider. That slows down their upload.
I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking how you would think that the commission should go about addressing that problem of the consumer not knowing where the problem is.
You know, if folks wanted to get together and try to forge out some consensus on transparency, that's terrific. I think those talks are undergoing right now. We want to make sure we can take yes for an answer. So if there's a consensus we can all hammer out, consumer groups, the agencies involved, industry, all the rest, that's terrific. There's a lot of precedent for that in a lot of different contexts over the years. But the reason I asked you that question is not just to be a smart aleck, but to say, where does it kind of end? You know, the internet ecosystem, I'm not going to try to define that, but that is a complex sphere, and there's a lot that's going on in it. So, for instance, the average consumer probably does not realize that peer-to-peer ties up their computer's processing power as well as saps their broadband capabilities and that of their neighbors if they're using coax or wireless-based broadband. So there's a lot going on there, and there are other complex markets we might want to draw analogies from to figure out how consumers are made aware there. But if you have more competition in the marketplace and give consumers more choices, then it can become self-regulating. Bless you.
Hi, Eliza Krigman, National Journal. Ostensibly, businesses don't ever want to be regulated. You know, sometimes it is in the public interest. I'm sure everybody would agree now that the mortgage industry could have used some more regulation a few years ago. So my question is, when you're talking with investors, what guides your thoughts to believe that this is legitimate concern on their end about being regulated more versus they just don't want to be regulated? That's the nature of business.
Well, I think what's one of the biggest concerns, first of all, in the broadband and telecom space and general communication space, the whole ICT space, there's a lot of government regulation already. it's one of the more regulated segments of our economy. And we, the FCC has sway, by some estimates, over about 1/6 of the economy. So there's lots of regulation there. I think the heart of the concern is the uncertainty that comes with a new regulatory regime. And in that, this is really all about net neutrality. It really is. So then it becomes a matter of what is the government's definition of reasonable. Okay? If you look at the world's largest democracy, India, they have a government-mandated reasonableness standard. And that is, by our definition, probably, at least by mine certainly, sort of unreasonable in how it's applied. It would violate directly with our First Amendment, violate our First Amendment directly. So there are so many questions that come up in terms of, we're going to have a case-by-case enforcement of a new standard. You're going to have a lot of uncertainty in terms of who's making those decisions. Is it 3 people at the FCC to get a majority of the FCC? And then do those decisions become politicized? Does the definition of reasonable become a political decision as administrations change here in Washington?
I've got a question, nobody else does. And also the premise that firms don't want to be regulated is not necessarily true, as we learned from the MCI's protestations about de-tariffing a few decades ago. Cable franchising is a creation of industry and is a barrier to entry. So firms often seek regulation as protection, but in fact most.
In fact, actually also add to that a little bit, we frequently get people coming to us and saying, please regulate my rival. My rival is running too fast, and would you please slow him or her down? So the whole notion, by the way, of regulatory capture and all that really is somewhat laughable in that frequently our decisions are choosing between which industry segment are we going to regulate over another.
My question deals with, since you've been in the commission for a while and certainly been involved in these issues for a long while, the data-driven arguments proposed by this commission, is it your experience recently that the agency is more data-driven than it has been historically? And second is your view that as much as the data being looked at, through what eyes you look at the data through is as important as more data?
I think it's too soon to tell that a lot of the big items that have been discussed in the past year or so haven't come to fruition, haven't come up for a vote yet. So we'll see. So there are a lot of, in other words, big important dockets that are still receiving comment and consideration, some that haven't even been initiated yet, and asking about a year or so.
Well, on that note, I want to thank Commissioner McDowell for coming again. We really appreciate it. And those of you on our areas, please get on it. We've got a lot of good research coming in the pipeline, and thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the next event.